welcome to the Disruptive by Design podcast. This episode is part of a series delving into disinformation. Today, we have two amazing experts from the field. First, we have Hannah Becker, who is the Vice President at Becker Digital, a service-disabled, veteran-owned small business that provides strategic consulting and training support to government agencies. From 2023 to 2024, Hannah served as a fellow at the Joint Special Operations University, where she researched the impacts of misinformation and disinformation on national security and the U.S. military. Hannah has also been a faculty member at Norwich University, Virginia Military Institute, Ottawa University, teaching cyber warfare, computer science, economics, and entrepreneurship courses. Additionally, Hannah developed one of the first digital literacy training programs that included misinformation and disinformation related solutions, specifically designed for Gen Z and millennial military audiences. As a military spouse, Hannah has served on the advisory board of the Military Family Advisory Network and as an outreach ambassador for the Military Officers Association of America. She's also a member of AFCEA Cyber Committee, where she researched the societal effects of misinformation and disinformation, cybersecurity education, and digital transformation initiatives across public and private sectors. And Hannah holds a bachelor's degree from Mississippi State University, graduate certificate in nonprofit leadership from American Public University, a master's degree in business administration, an MBA, and a Master of Science in Information Technology, an MSIT from Florida Institute of Technology. We also have Dr. Welton Chang, and Dr. Chang is co-founder and CEO of Pyra Technologies, whose groundbreaking platforms help identify threats on social media to individuals. Before co-founding Pyra Technologies, Dr. Chang was the first Chief Technology Officer at Human Rights First, and he founded HRF's Innovation Lab. Prior to joining HRF, Dr. Chang was a senior researcher at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, APL, where he helped teams and develop technical solutions to address disinformation and online propaganda. Before joining APL, Dr. Chang served for nearly a decade as an intelligence officer at the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, and in the U.S. Army, including 2 operational tours in Iraq and South Korea. Dr. Chang received a PhD and an MA from the University of Pennsylvania, an MA from Georgetown University, and a BA from Dartmouth College. And it's so great to have experts from such as your caliber for both of you. So thanks for taking the time, Hannah and Dr. Chang. Welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Kim.
Yeah, I'm so excited to delve into this topic of disinformation. But maybe we could start with the basics. What is disinformation and how is it, I guess, different than misinformation? Because those two sometimes get confused. And then, so what is the disinformation and why is it important that we talk about it? Thanks. And Hannah, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, so misinformation, for me, the easiest way to remember the definitions is they're both false information, but it's about the intent behind them. So misinformation, it's wrong, but it's not necessarily malicious in intent. Whoever created it, whoever spread it, they just got their facts wrong. But disinformation is truly information weaponized. So it's deliberately deceitful. It has malintent. It's created with the point and the objective of manipulating people or groups of people into doing something. And in the case of disinformation, the something that they want us to do isn't good stuff. So we're dealing with this kind of level of influence at a scale that, thanks to technology, we haven't seen before. And so that's kind of the clicker with disinformation. What makes it so different than, propaganda and influence campaigns and other mediums is with social media, it can spread like wildfire.
Right, sure. And Dr. Chang, can you explain from your viewpoint, what's disinformation and why is it important that we speak about it?
I mean, Hannah's absolutely right about intent being the dividing line between misinformation and disinformation. I do think one of the um, you know things that we face when it comes to disinformation is that foreign nation state actors can take advantage of the pathways that have developed for how to spread this information in order to influence democratic populations. And this is a challenge because, well, it's just easy to do from afar. The internet is pervasive, and if you're trying to um, influence an election somewhere, if you're trying to influence foreign policy or public policy somewhere, it's just a high return on investment activity to do it via these online avatars and profiles, especially on social networks where my company does its work. It's getting harder and harder to discern between users who are genuinely who they say they are, and not even to take into account the proliferation of generative AI technologies, where it's harder and harder to distinguish between who's human and who's non-human. So that's the challenge that we face, is that if you're trying to um, influence, spread your influence online, it just makes sense to do it via these disinfo tactics that have cropped up in the last decade or so.
Right, sure. Yeah, I don't think I heard the term so much disinformation or misinformation, years ago. So it's definitely a serious issue of today. Hannah, can you talk about who does disinformation impact?
Yeah, so the tricky thing about disinformation is that it has the potential to impact everyone. So when we think about targets, essentially anyone and everyone can be a target of bad actors, foreign influence, enemy states using disinformation. So one thing that I've encountered kind of working in this space over the past few years is that some people think that they're kind of inherently immune to disinformation because they are techie, or they have a certain degree of education, or they think critically. But in reality, we're seeing that folks really don't realize that they are being targeted, and kind of the breadth of that targeting. I think when we had done the white paper with AFCEA, there was kind of this idea that Gen Zers, so the generation considered digital natives, would be more immune to disinformation because they spend so much time online. And the research was indicating they were just as vulnerable to it, and or more so. Just because they're spending lots of time online didn't translate to having digital media literacy skills or an awareness related to kind of the threats and vulnerabilities that accompany being in a digital kind of domain. So that's kind of that, to me, that was kind of interesting, is that we may not be the best assessors of whether or not we're immune to disinformation. And it kind of, to me, just highlighted just how vulnerable, we can be to these types of attacks. The other thing that I wanted to kind of highlight, that for me is just a big frustration with disinformation, is you don't even have to be on social media to be impacted by it. Like, you don't have to be clicking, consuming disinformation. As Welton mentioned, social media is just so pervasive in our society, the global world, with hyperconnectivity that like we've got. What happens online has the potential to impact the real world. And we've seen this in so many ways. I mean, with the pandemic and health, healthcare decisions, we've seen this even with hurricane response. FEMA's been, having trouble, especially down in North Carolina and some of the other states, where they're having to counter disinformation online. People are resistant to even like seek or receive aid as they do their door-to-door kind of aid programs. It's sowing, distrust, it's changing people's beliefs. And this impacts not only social media users, but all the communities that are involved in this. So with emergency management, whether that's a global pandemic or, hurricane or flooding in the mountains, we're seeing it just go way beyond the screen as far as impacts, which can be kind of a scary thought. And especially if we like to kind of compartmentalize this to, oh, that's just happening on the internet, when it's really, it's just very pervasive.
Right. Yeah, that is such an impact. And Dr. Chang, can you kind of walk us through the roots of really how does disinformation work? How does it influence or change someone's behavior?
Yeah, I mean, it's no coincidence that this information spreads so quickly on social media, because the first thing that it does is it grabs your attention. And the platforms have been designed to be basically attention monopolizing enterprises to keep you there longer, reading more and more information. And typically, the effect of disinformation, at least, is going to at first grab your eyeballs and get you to look at the information. And when you're processing it, the problem is, especially how we process information online, you have to understand the information you're looking at before you can formulate a way to refute it. And if you are interrupted in that process, it makes it harder for you to, at first thing is just to remember to refute it in your head. And the second thing is you're prone to misremembering in the future something that you encountered as true when it may have been false. So there's a couple of different kind of psychological mechanisms operating at that level. And the other piece of kind of bias that's operating is this concept called confirmation bias, where it's essentially easier for us to process information that we already agree with. And when you encounter that information, if you're being targeted, if you come across it inadvertently, if it is something that you already have some level of agreement with, you're more likely to accept it as true, even if it's not. And that's part of the challenge that we face today in the United States, is that we are so polarized. We are so it has become so hard for us to disregard information that may be false because simply, one, it makes us feel good, or we agree with it. And we need to build up our kind of defenses to this information that we might come across, that's going to further inflame us, further divide us. And that's the key piece of what's operating on social media. If I could just really quickly touch on something that Hannah was talking about, the audience, your audience, is full of people who are in the military, were in the military, and they're being targeted, even if they don't think they are. Why are they being targeted? By especially nation state actors who are deploying kind of weapons grade disinformation. Well, the first thing is, if a foreign actor can get a member of the military or a veteran to agree with them, that's going to further transmit into their communities. There's been lots of research on the communication side, as well as kind of public policy polling research showing that even in today's kind of low credibility environment, the military does still hold a position of trust within the community, within the nation. And so if they're being targeted, and just a few of them become transmitters of disinformation, that's going to further spread into the population. So not only is spreading disinformation a high ROI activity to begin with, it's even higher ROI when you're going after an audience like the one that you have. And that's, it's kind of a multiplicative effect when it comes to spreading disinformation.
Right, sure. And kind of at the beginning, when you talked about what the difference was between disinformation and misinformation, it's this malintent, this adversarial, activity. Can you guys delve into kind of where is the disinformation coming from? Who is weaponizing it? And kind of give us a picture from that side of things.
There's terrorist groups that can utilize this, general just bad actors. It's a super cheap way to basically deliver a lot of destruction. So disinformation, I mean, you can just have someone behind a screen on the other side of the world, basically launching these attacks against democracy. Their goal is for us to see something, feel something like, oh gosh, or, something intense, have that emotional reaction, share it, change our beliefs, change our values, and then in certain cases, drive us to do certain things that may be against our best interests. Maybe they want us to vote a certain way. Maybe they want us to, kind of dismantle our trusted organizations, like lose trust in the federal government, lose trust in the U.S. military, lose trust in healthcare. They want us to kind of have these feelings, these reactions, and then kind of do the work of the enemy from within, which is kind of crazy if you think about it. If any of the countries mentioned or, terrorist groups that are, kind of frequent offenders on disinformation were to launch, missiles at the US, we would, unite and have that reaction of, oh, we must defend ourselves. But this happens all the time online, and they're just playing us, they're manipulating us. And so I think that's something that, I wish people understood. I don't like being played with. I don't like being manipulated. And I feel like a missing piece when I talk about mis and disinformation is that people don't realize that, they are being targeted and that they can be susceptible. The only other thing, I know Dr. Chang probably has a lot more on kind of who is authoring, the disinformation campaigns. But one thing I did want to kind of mention was those are kind of the frequent offenders, the big organizations that we think about. Disinformation, we're seeing, it is effective to cause damage to people, to organizations, to communities. And it's not always just, the large kind of terrorist groups or enemy states doing this. A few years ago, I was working out in Wyoming on a project, and we actually, there was this kind of like eco nonprofit group that had launched this quite well done, I guess you could say, quite elaborate disinformation campaign against this state park. And they were targeting state park employees and their family members. There was a lot of reputation damage. And it was about kind of expanding out the state park's recreation zone there, which for me, that was an aha moment. I was like, wow, this is being done by kind of a relatively small group of people. They consider what they're doing grassroots, but they're really using the same mechanism of disinformation to cause harm to, a state government, employees. And the clicker for me was their families, like targeting these employees and their families. which I just, couldn't believe they would go there, but it was like, wow, this mechanism of disinformation is very effective. To Dr. Chang's point, it is so like basement bargain, low budget access to use with a massive impact. So I wish people understood that, that it has this level of a payload. But I'll pause there and
Right, sure. I love your passion about it, Hannah, and your depth of knowledge. And Dr. Chang, from your perspective, where are you seeing, and you're kind of, knee deep in the weeds in this, but where is disinformation coming from, and who are you seeing is doing the weaponizing?
Yeah, I mean, especially this year, we've gotten and seen a steady drumbeat of reports come out over the last 3 to 4 months indicating that China, Iran, and Russia are all involved in various kinds of conspiracy theories, disinformation. Some of it is quite narrow, perhaps targeting foreign policy goals, such as military support to Ukraine. Some of it more expansive, targeting the 2024 election. And I think what's interesting is if you go back to 2016 and that presidential election, the campaign that was launched at that time, primarily by the Russian Internet Research Agency, based in St. Petersburg, that was somewhat understood in the lead up to the actual election, and then much better understood in its aftermath. Covered in multiple reports from the FBI, from other places, discussing the tactics that were used. At the time, Twitter and also Facebook released several large public data sets that talked about and demonstrated the breadth of those campaigns. And then in 2020, things, I would say, were more quiet. Certainly there were still efforts going on, but there wasn't the kind of steady drumbeat that you're hearing now coming from other organizations like NewsGuard, the Microsoft Threat Analysis Center, which is doing some of the leading work and identifying and attributing who's doing who's the one behind the campaign. And I think one of the interesting things here is to think about the comparisons between these campaigns versus an advertising campaign for a product. Somebody who, let's say you manufacture cereal. In the United States, we have laws that say that, basically laws against false advertising. We don't have something similar to that effect when it comes to political content. And we likely can't because of free speech and the First Amendment, but that gives an opening for these outside entities to take advantage of our society's openness to spread false information that can further harm and divide us. And just like we have ad blockers on our apps, right? We don't think twice about not getting served an ad, but we have our kind of digital defenses down when it comes to receiving and reading disinformation, especially the kinds where there are, hundreds of people sitting in another time zone who are really, really trying their best to make you see this information and then make you believe the thing that's there. And it's especially heightened right now with the election right around the corner. I think one of the things for your audience to recognize is these folks are out there. They can be somewhat sophisticated in their tactics, where they maybe build on a kernel of truth that's verifiable, and then the rest of it is out of context and false. But that's something where most of it, Hannah said low budget. Like a lot of this stuff is just it's not that well done. It just takes advantage of the fact that we may already agree with the information that's there, and then we don't think twice, and we, reshare it or spread it to other people, and then eventually we learn, oh wait, that was false information. I probably shouldn't have done that. So.
Right, sure. And Dr. Tang, there was a term you mentioned that I wanted to ask you about. You mentioned kind of military grade disinformation. What does that mean, compared to kind of the things that are just, quickly or cheaply done? What's the scale of that you're seeing?
Yeah, and this is an evolving area where, and we saw it executed pretty well in 2016, where there's a combination of a cyber attack, basically a hack against an entity, and then releasing that information in order to influence an audience. We saw reports earlier, I think it was last week or the week before, where there were Chinese hackers trying to get into the phones of the former president, President Trump, and presidential candidate Senator J.D. Vance's phones. And you can think of lots of ways in which there's information there that may be deployed in a way that's used for disinformation, and spreading that information, but you don't see that kind of action being taken by just any old random actor, right? You really have to have sophisticated methods in order to first conduct the hack. Second, spend a lot of time, doing the targeting, understanding how you're going to deploy that information once you've obtained it. And that is the key difference between just your average run-of-the-mill person who might be interested in conducting a disinformation campaign versus a concerted effort from a state entity that is well practiced and deeply understands the kinds of information that are going to get an audience to glom onto it and spread it. So not to say that the former is not dangerous as well, because again, we are in this kind of low effort processing environment, right, when it comes to information. But the thing that's going to more likely go viral, more likely have an impact, is the kinds of stuff that's being kind of collected and then deployed by state actors.
Right, sure. And I think there was an area you researched, Dr. Tang, kind of related to Africa and Russia about malaria. Can you share something about that?
I don't think I researched it. I think it was a report that came out, in the news media. But Russia has had a long history of trying to interfere on the kind of bioweapons side. They used a similar strain of disinformation when it came to HIV back in the 80s, and saying that the US basically developed the virus and were deliberately infecting people with it. And they can use similar efforts to do things like justify the invasion of Ukraine, where they said that the US was sponsoring bioweapons labs in the Ukraine. And similarly, to undermine malaria eradication efforts in Africa, they've done something similar. So, we talked about how Hannah mentioned the scale of it is different now. The tactics aren't different. The ways in which the stuff has been deployed in the past, people may have heard it called propaganda. The first kind of mass dissemination of that came about with the advent of the radio. But it all has a similar kind of heartbeat. It's just beating a lot faster now and going after areas where you may not even realize that the Russians have an interest in undermining different efforts, but they are out there. They're doing it, and they're thinking about it every day, and they're thinking about how to improve it every day. And that's the difference again between your run-of-the-mill folks and the folks that are basically do this for a living, as a job, as a profession.
Right. Wow. Yeah. And, you all talked about kind of really everyone is a target now. So we all have to be aware. And can you talk about, given your, military related experience and knowledge, kind of delve into kind of how is this targeting or affecting veterans and the military? And it's like you're saying, Dr. Chang, it's not just, it's coming so much quicker. It's not the propaganda from World War II from our adversaries of that time, Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan dropping leaflets to target American warfighters to, attempt at, degrading their morale. It's not obvious like that, where it's just dropping leaflets, something that's discernible. But can you talk about kind of how veterans and military are at risk? And Hannah, I guess, go to you first.
Yeah. Yeah, I liked Dr. Chang's mention of kind of the heartbeat, beating faster now, because that's, the stuff that they're putting out, disinformation, it's good. A lot of what I see is good. It in terms of not like good as immoral, like effective. I've gotten to where when I see stuff online, if I have like an emotional response to it, like for me, that's a red flag. I'll be like, wait, what, is this intending to manipulate me, or is this, real? Within the kind of the military communities, I initially approached them a few years ago, assuming that just kind of the nature of military training and culture, they would be very non-susceptible to disinformation. I felt like basically OPSEC on steroids would be enough to kind of like keep them from being susceptible to that. When I started kind of getting in the weeds with it, that's not what I found. Disinformation is being used against both, active duty, military service members, and then the veteran community in a couple different ways. Trying to sow division, trying to get them to lose trust, even promoting stereotypes about service members and veterans to civilian population, and then kind of radicalizing, promoting extremism, encouraging even terrorist actions. Two areas within kind of the military community, projects that I've worked on over the past 2 years that on the surface seem very different. However, the common theme is disinformation with them. One with the VA, so with the disabled veterans and their family members, seemed a lot of disinformation related to kind of veteran benefits and health care being targeted. My company, our company, Becker Digital, does a lot of work. We support the VA in a couple different programs. Both my spouse and I receive care from the VA. We are very kind of in the, familiar with VA programs and kind of the services that are provided there. And it really just kind of breaks my heart to see veterans and their family members that would be qualified to receive services consuming a lot of disinformation related to that. They're being manipulated in ways that have negative outcomes on their life, whether that's healthcare or even just manipulated and kind of trying, with disinformation, trying to radicalize them to engage in acts of extremism. So that was the first project. It surprised me. It shouldn't have, I guess, but it did, to just kind of see that in that space. I get disinformation for that stuff, which is kind of funny to me, given that, I researched this. And then the second area that was another surprising point was with the Federal Service Academies. So 3, West Point, the Air Force Academy, and then the Naval Academy in Annapolis. They've got a big problem, have had it for a few years, with disinformation coming through a hyperlocal anonymous social media app called Yodel. It's based out of Germany. I've spent years documenting and kind of reviewing this type of content there. It's super weaponized, it's super manipulative, encourages dissent, encourages actions that are egregious, outside the bounds of acceptable, such as horrible things like rape, suicide, cheating, drug use, hate crimes. all of this going on these Yodel feeds related to the service academies. And as I've kind of gotten into kind of researching and peeling back the layers with Yodel, it's interesting if you kind of track kind of where it came from, how it got introduced to the academies, why this particular, kind of group of service members were targeted for disinformation coming in this way. So two very different groups, cadets and midshipmen at service academies, and then disabled veterans and their families. But on both fronts, we're seeing disinformation targeting them. The takeaway is, it's manipulative and it's for bad outcomes. It's trying to get people to do bad things. And so the takeaway for me with this was just, military veterans, not an automatically or inherently immune population when it comes to being targeted by disinformation. And there's a lot of ways it's coming at them.
Right, sure. And Dr. Chang, I know you've delved into this greatly. Can you share your thoughts?
Yeah, just building on what Hannah so definitely relayed. I mean, part of this is the kinds of topics that are of interest to the military community can be natural ones for Russia and China to want to interfere in, right? When we're talking about, whether our foreign policy in Ukraine is working, whether or not the United States should defend a country like Taiwan, right? Those are naturally going to be things that people in the military care about because they may get involved in those areas at some point in their careers. So the fact that there is information being put out by these entities about those issues, folks are going to naturally come across it in their daily work, right? I remember there are several websites. I believe DC Weekly is one of them that was identified by the Microsoft Threat Analysis Center and by others as being essentially a Russian propaganda outlet. And that again is another area where, in the past, you didn't naturally see people kind of parroting Kremlin talking points. But because they created these sites to look like legitimate news sites, and it's harder and harder to discern between what's legitimate and what's not online, you're more and more seeing folks kind of spreading that information without understanding the provenance of it. And it takes an extra step for you to understand and realize that information is not coming from a legitimate news source, that it's coming from essentially a Kremlin mouthpiece. But it is a step that you have to take, right, to evaluate what the source veracity is in much the same way that you do it in your regular work, right? Whether you work in on the operational side or on the intelligence side, right? You always have to look at where are you getting the information from and can you trust it? So no longer is it sufficient for you to see, oh, it has a glitzy website, it's probably real. It's very easy to set up a glitzy website now, right? And it's even easier to create fake articles, which several other outlets have identified as tactics that have been utilized by both the Chinese and the Russians, right? To use generative AI to create articles that further their foreign policy interests and make, in the past, you might be able to identify, oh, this doesn't exactly sound like perfect English. Well, you can't use that as a differentiator anymore, right? This kind of native language identifying mechanism because generative AI exists and these folks are able to take advantage of the different services that are out there in order to create those articles. So yeah, it's definitely something that folks have to be aware of, keep their antenna up for, and that's what makes it so challenging to operate today.
Right, sure. Yeah, that's great advice to keep your antenna up, know exactly where you're getting the information from. What other advice do you have about what we can do? It seems so very overwhelming. But yeah, any other solutions?
Yeah, I just have a couple of kind of rules of thumb for folks, right? I like to think of, I think it was Carl Sagan who said, keep an open mind, but not so open that your brain falls out, right? Um, you know, when you see something fantastic or incredible, right? It does require incredible levels of evidence in order to substantiate, right? Um, and I gave a lecture a couple of weeks ago to a student audience, and it was the same day that the um, Puff Daddy P Diddy indictment came out, and there was some line in there about him having, and your audience may find this funny, something like 1,000 bottles of lubricant in his house. And at first, you read that, and you're probably saying to yourself, that can't possibly be true. But it turns out that it is. Um, what I'm trying to illustrate to the audience is sometimes there are things that are fantastic that um, that are true. But where did that information come from? Well, it came from an indictment with, the backing of law enforcement evidentiary procedures, right? Similarly, high quality journalistic outfits have to adhere to high levels of, source confirmation, understanding if the source does have, in the military parlance, placement and access to have that information. Whereas folks on social media are not held to those standards, right? So I think part of this is how you're being critical with the information that you're saying, understanding that certain creators of information, transmitters of information do have higher standards when it comes to whether or not they can substantiate a claim or not. And then I think the last thing I'll just say to the audience is, look, you don't have to be first. Oftentimes, being the first to see information, being the first to reshare the information, a lot of the times it's wrong. And there's really no value for you to be first if it's not your day job, really. So, take a deep breath, take a step back, be considerate when you're sharing information, and let's all be a part of the solution for how we slow down the spread of false information. And keep our communities free of that foreign influence.
And how about you, from your perspective, Hannah?
Yeah, well, no, those are great recommendations. The solutions to disinformation's been kind of always a hotly contested topic. I wish there was an easy answer to it. I wish there was a switch. I'm reminded my grandmother was a huge fan of the tabloids. And I remember growing up where we lived, where Elvis was born in rural Mississippi. So she was obsessed with like Elvis sightings. And so every week at the grocery store, she would pick up one of the tabloids if they had like an Elvis sighting in there, that he wasn't the dead, the king of rock and roll, not dead. Here's a sighting. And I remember being 6 or 7 and like telling my grandma, I'm like, I don't think, that's Elvis. It's like a really crude photo, or I don't think he'd be like mowing lawns in like, California for a living if he was really still alive. Like I was like providing her this evidence. And in the end, it was relatively harmless. My grandmother thought, he was still alive. Who cares? That's her little thing. But with disinformation, kind of the impact is so broad. And I feel like some people approach it kind of like me with my grandmother's little tabloid interests, like, whatever, this is her little hobby, if you will. The thing is with disinformation, it's not benign. It's a big deal. And essentially kind of, our enemies, whether it's other nations, whether it's terrorist groups or, kind of bad actors, they would love for us to just take everything that we see online at face value. They would love for us to just react with rage and hate and just truly kind of tear our nation, our organizations, our communities apart from the inside. And they don't even ever have to set boots on the ground in the US. This is all done from behind a screen. And I feel like I wish people would recognize kind of what's going on, the reality of not only kind of a war for the cognitive space or the attention, but also kind of the digital fog that accompanies it when we're talking about cyberspace. I appreciate Dr. Chang's recommendations on just kind of slowing down, thinking critically. You don't have to be first to share, and would just kind of echo the emphasis on, educating yourself, good digital media literacy skills, develop those, think about kind of, there's not a switch to just turn this off. This is the reality. You've got to operate within this environment. Disinformation's a fact. You're likely to be targeted for it. You may have certain vulnerabilities there that you can kind of strengthen up in yourself, through building things like cognitive resilience, digital media literacy skills. The only other thing, which I know we'll list some of those resources in the show notes, but the other thing I would mention, which goes kind of beyond tech, is I would, encourage people to think about why we're so vulnerable to this. This isn't just a Pavlovian dog kind of, feedback loop here. We crave connection. We are using social media to facilitate this. Think about kind of in your own life, kind of building maybe a healthier approach to your community, or maybe getting more involved in your community. These things can have kind of protective defenses against you being very vulnerable to disinformation. If you have those real life in-person ties to others, healthy relationships, and investment in your community or your nation for that matter. So I would just encourage people to kind of keep or look at it from a holistic standpoint, not just thinking that increasing social media regulations is going to be like the fix all for that, because the train has so left the station on this, and so there is a level of individual responsibility that I think accompanies kind of surviving and hopefully thriving in the digital age.
Right, I love that emphasis on real life connections. That's great advice. And I did want to list for everyone some of the resources so everyone can benefit from your all's extensive research. So Dr. Chang's company is Pyrotech. So the website is www.pyrratech.com, pyrotech.com. And they have a terrific newsletter. Dr. Chang, do you want to talk about the newsletter?
Yeah, it's published on a weekly basis. It is derived from about 50 to 70 million posts that we collect during that time span. And we distill for the audience most of the trending narratives that are popping up on the fringes of the internet. And one of the things that we joke in the company is that, hey, if it's in the newsletter, 2 weeks later, it's going to be on the front page of the newspaper. So, yeah, it's if you want to stay ahead of what narratives are bubbling to the surface, definitely sign up for it. It's free, and it's you can subscribe to it on our website.
Yeah, that's an invaluable intelligence digest. And so for people who are interested in that, www.pyrotech.com/#subscribe. So look out for that. And then definitely look out from Becker Digital, their digital media literacy crisis. And Hannah, I don't know if you want to discuss that at all, but it has links to multiple online training resources, which I think is invaluable.
Yeah, so it's got links to a variety of kind of free online training resources for all ages, from elementary school to adults. And you don't have to be a techie person to benefit or even access those. So I would encourage you to check those out if you're interested in strengthening your digital media literacy skills.
Right. And the idea for this podcast series came originally from a webinar that AFCEA did called Digital Chatter, the Growing Challenge of Disinformation. And it's on demand on AFCEA's website. So definitely look for that. It has kind of really some great information. And then that was also based on the AFCEA Digital Chatter white paper that Hannah mentioned previously called The Growing Challenge of Disinformation. And then we'll put some other links up. There's some great articles. The Chaos Machine, the inside story of how social media rewired our minds and our world by Max Fisher. And Information Warfare, Lessons in Inoculation to Disinformation by several authors. And this is an excellent resource on disinformation impacts on the US military. And then I think there's one more, Department of Homeland Security, Media Literacy and Critical Thinking Online, Tools and Resources. And anything you guys wanted to add?
Just thanks so much for having us, Kim. It's a pleasure. And yeah, if folks want to get in touch with us, please do reach out. You can get to us via our website. And yeah, just thanks again.
Yeah, thanks, Kimberly.
Yeah, thanks to you, Hannah and Dr. Chang. Thanks so much for taking the time and sharing your expertise and insights on this important topic. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.